By the time German headquarters realized what was happening, it was already too late. George S. Patton was no longer advancing according to expectations, timetables, or doctrine, and that terrified the men trying to stop him. This was not a breakthrough they could plug with reserves or slow with counterorders. It was something far more dangerous, momentum that refused to pause. German generals were trained to respond to pressure with structure, lines, and containment. Patton offered none of that. He moved too fast, changed direction too quickly, and exploited hesitation the moment it appeared. What the German command faced in late summer 1944 was not just an aggressive opponent, but the collapse of their ability to control the battlefield at all. Patton's Third Army had been unleashed after the breakout from Normandy, and from the start, it behaved unlike anything the Germans had faced on the Western Front. Where other Allied forces paused to consolidate, Patton drove forward. Where doctrine demanded caution, he demanded speed. Columns advanced day and night, often outrunning their supply lines, seizing crossings and towns before German commanders even realized they were threatened. Patton understood something his opponents did not grasp quickly enough. After weeks of attritional fighting, the German army was brittle. It could still fight, but only if given time. Patton denied them that time. German generals initially misread the advance. They assumed it was reckless. They expected the Americans to slow down once logistics became strained or resistance stiffened. They believed counterattacks could restore order. This assumption proved fatal. Patton did not slow. When fuel ran short, he shifted priorities. When resistance stiffened, he bypassed it. When flanks appeared exposed, he accepted the risk. Speed was not just a tactic, it was the strategy. Every delay in German decision-making compounded the damage. The German command system was poorly suited to this kind of war. Orders flowed downward slowly. Initiative was constrained by fear of disobedience. Units waited for instructions that arrived too late. Patton exploited this rigidity mercilessly. He forced German commanders into a reactive posture they could not escape. Each attempt to form a defensive line was outpaced. Each effort to regroup was interrupted by unexpected thrusts. What should have been a controlled withdrawal became a series of improvisations under pressure. Reports reaching German headquarters grew increasingly alarming. Units were being outflanked rather than engaged head-on. Key road junctions were falling without major battles. Communications were breaking down as headquarters relocated repeatedly to avoid encirclement. The language of these reports changed subtly but decisively, from delaying actions to loss of contact, from repositioning to forced withdrawal. German generals were not just losing ground, they were losing coherence. What made the situation worse was Patton's unpredictability. He did not behave like a commander seeking symbolic objectives. He did not pause to secure every town. He targeted mobility, crossings, and junctions, the connective tissue of German defense. This created cascading effects. A single lost bridge could isolate entire formations. A rapid thrust into open country could unravel a sector without a set-piece battle. German plans depended on time and predictability. Patton removed both. By the time German generals attempted to impose control, ordering standfasts, designating defensive lines, threatening punishment for retreat, it was already too late. The battlefield had become fluid, and their command structure was designed for rigidity. Patton's advance turned German strengths into liabilities. Discipline became paralysis. Caution became delay. Order became confusion. This was the moment German generals began to understand that they were no longer dictating the tempo of the war. They were responding to it, and failing. Patton had transformed speed into a weapon they could not counter with doctrine or tradition. The containment they relied on was collapsing not because of overwhelming force, but because of relentless movement. The day German generals could no longer contain Patton was not marked by a single battle or dramatic defeat. It was marked by a realization spreading through command rooms and field reports alike. The war in the West had entered a phase they were no longer equipped to manage, and once that realization set in, There was no way to reverse it. The German command problem was not that George S. Patton was winning battles. It was that he was refusing to fight them on German terms at all. From the moment Third Army broke into open country, Patton turned movement itself into an offensive weapon. He did not seek decisive engagements in the traditional sense. He sought dislocation. Every mile advanced without resistance was a mile stolen from German planning. Every sudden change of direction forced enemy commanders to redraw maps that were already obsolete by the time the ink dried. German generals had prepared for an Allied advance that behaved predictably. They expected pauses for resupply, consolidation after contact, and caution near exposed flanks. That expectation shaped every defensive plan they attempted to assemble. Patton shattered it. His columns moved even when fuel was scarce. Units were rerouted on the move. Orders were issued verbally, sometimes shouted from vehicles, prioritizing momentum over neat organization. To German observers, this looked chaotic. In reality, it was controlled aggression designed to stay ahead of the enemy's decision cycle. The effect on German defensive planning was devastating. Defensive lines require time to form. Reserves must be identified, moved, and committed. Patton allowed none of that. By the time a German corps commander realized where the threat lay, American units were already beyond that point, striking somewhere else entirely. Attempts to block Patton's advance often resulted in German units arriving at positions that were no longer relevant, or worse, already bypassed. Speed transformed German caution into vulnerability. This was most visible at road junctions and river crossings. Patton prioritized terrain that forced decisions. He drove hard for bridges before they could be destroyed, seized crossroads that anchored entire defensive sectors, and cut lateral routes that German units depended on for maneuver. A single captured junction could force an entire German division to withdraw prematurely. These were not dramatic set-piece victories. They were operational amputations, severing the enemy's ability to function as a coherent force. German generals reacted as they always had, by ordering containment. Units were instructed to hold ground, delay the Americans, and wait for reinforcements. But containment requires mass and coordination. Patton attacked where neither existed. His advance created a string of localized crises that German command could not prioritize effectively. Every request for support competed with another. Every threatened sector demanded resources that no longer existed. The result was a command paralysis where doing nothing felt safer than doing the wrong thing. As reports flowed upward, a pattern emerged that deeply unsettled German headquarters. American units were not stopping when they should have. They were not pausing at natural defensive barriers. They were not slowing under pressure. German staff officers began using language that betrayed their anxiety. Unexpected speed, unusual aggressiveness, lack of pause. These were not compliments. They were admissions that established assumptions no longer applied. What made the situation worse was Patton's willingness to accept risk. German doctrine assumed that exposed flanks were invitations to counterattack. Patton understood that German forces no longer had the flexibility to exploit those opportunities quickly. He gambled, correctly, that speed would compensate for exposure. By the time German units attempted to strike his flanks, they were often attacking shadows, while the main force surged forward elsewhere. Risk became asymmetric. What endangered Patton theoretically endangered German command practically. German generals began to face a terrifying reality. They were no longer fighting a linear campaign. The front was dissolving into a series of disconnected actions driven by American initiative. Maps became less useful, lines meant less. The war was no longer about holding ground, it was about chasing movement. And German command systems, built for control and order, were ill-equipped for pursuit under pressure. Patton's advance forced German generals into a constant state of reaction. Reaction breeds delay. Delay breeds collapse. Every hour spent trying to contain the Americans was an hour Patton used to move again. What the Germans mistook for recklessness was in fact calculation. Patton understood that modern war rewarded tempo more than elegance. He did not need to destroy every German unit. He only needed to keep them from organizing. By the end of this phase, German generals were no longer asking how to stop Patton. They were asking where he would strike next, and discovering that by the time they knew, it was already happening. The battle was no longer about ground. It was about time, and Patton was stealing it faster than they could react. The breaking point came quietly, through routine reports that suddenly stopped making sense. German headquarters were still issuing orders to contain George S. Patton, but the language had begun to shift. Where earlier messages spoke of delaying actions and fallback lines, new reports described units that could no longer locate friendly formations, roads that were no longer under German control, and American forces appearing far deeper than any plan had anticipated. This was the moment containment ceased to be a strategy and became a reflex, automatic, desperate, and increasingly useless. German generals attempted to reassert control by drawing new defensive lines on maps that were already outdated. They designated rivers, towns, and road junctions as anchors, issuing stand-fast orders meant to stabilize the front. But Patton's advance was not respecting those anchors. American columns bypassed strongpoints, crossed secondary routes, and reappeared where German planners least expected them. Each new defensive line existed only on paper. On the ground, it dissolved before it could solidify. The psychological impact inside German command rooms was severe. Containment doctrine depended on predictability. It assumed the enemy would slow when stretched, pause when exposed, and consolidate after success. Patton did none of these. Instead, he treated German hesitation as an invitation. Every pause on their side became an opening on his. Every attempt to regroup created a target of opportunity. German generals found themselves fighting not an opponent, but a moving problem they could not pin down. This loss of control quickly translated into panic at lower levels. Divisions received conflicting orders: hold here, withdraw there, counterattack immediately, wait for reinforcements that never arrived. Communications broke down as headquarters relocated repeatedly to avoid encirclement. Officers began making decisions without guidance, not out of initiative, but necessity. What appeared from above as disobedience was, on the ground, survival. The command structure was fracturing under the strain of constant movement imposed by Patton's advance. Attempts to launch counterattacks only worsened the situation. German units assembled piecemeal, often without proper reconnaissance or coordination, and were committed against an enemy that had already shifted position. These counterattacks failed not because of lack of courage, but because they were always late. Patton's tempo ensured that German responses targeted yesterday's battlefield rather than today's. Each failed counterstroke consumed resources the Germans could not replace, accelerating the collapse they were meant to prevent. German generals began to recognize a terrifying pattern. The more they tried to impose control, the faster they lost it. Orders intended to stabilize the front instead exposed weaknesses. Threats of punishment for unauthorized withdrawal only increased chaos, as commanders delayed retreat until it became a rout. Containment required discipline, but discipline without flexibility became paralysis. Patton exploited that paralysis relentlessly. The language in German situation reports grew increasingly stark. Words like fluid, unclear, and loss of contact appeared with alarming frequency. These were not tactical descriptions. They were admissions that the battlefield was slipping beyond command. The war had ceased to behave in ways German doctrine could manage. The front was no longer a line. It was a series of gaps widening faster than anyone could close them. This was the moment German generals understood that Patton could not be contained because he was not trying to be contained. He was not seeking decisive confrontation. He was dismantling their ability to decide at all. Speed had turned into dominance, not by destroying German forces outright, but by denying them the time and coherence needed to fight effectively. By the end of this phase, containment had become an illusion everyone pretended to maintain while knowing it was already gone. German generals were no longer shaping events. They were reacting to a force that refused to slow down long enough to be controlled. Panic did not arrive with a single defeat. It seeped in as the realization that every tool they relied on was failing at once. This was no longer a battle for territory. It was a collapse of command. And once that collapse began, there was nothing left for Patton to break, only space to exploit. The moment German generals realized they could no longer contain George S. Patton, they also realized something far worse. Their maps no longer described the war they were fighting. Headquarters were still drawing lines, assigning sectors, and issuing movement orders. But those instructions increasingly described a battlefield that no longer existed. Roads marked as secure were already in American hands. Towns listed as defensive anchors had been bypassed. Entire formations were maneuvering based on information that was hours, sometimes days, out of date. Control had not just weakened, it had become fictional. Patton's advance accelerated this breakdown by attacking the German system's greatest weakness, its reliance on centralized awareness. German doctrine assumed that higher headquarters maintained a clear operational picture and issued coherent orders downward. Patton shattered that assumption by moving faster than information could travel. Reconnaissance reports arrived too late. Signals were interrupted by retreat and relocation. Commanders were forced to choose between waiting for clarity that would never arrive or acting blindly. Either choice favored Patton. As American columns surged forward, German generals attempted to restore order by prioritizing geography. Rivers, ridgelines, and urban centers were declared critical. Holding these points, they believed, would slow the advance and buy time to reorganize. But Patton treated geography as flexible. If a river crossing was defended, he found another. If a town was fortified, he bypassed it. If resistance thickened, he shifted direction. The Germans were defending fixed points in a war that had become fluid. This mismatch produced cascading failures. Units assigned to hold key terrain discovered that adjacent formations had already withdrawn or been cut off. Defensive positions that required mutual support stood alone. Requests for reinforcement collided with reality. Reserves did not exist in sufficient strength, and moving them required time the Germans no longer had. Patton's speed turned German planning horizons into liabilities. The more elaborate the plan, the more likely it was to collapse before execution. German commanders began issuing increasingly rigid orders in an attempt to regain control. Stand-fast directives multiplied. Retreat required explicit authorization. Disobedience was threatened with severe punishment. These measures, intended to impose discipline, had the opposite effect. They froze units in place until withdrawal became impossible, transforming controlled retreats into chaotic breakouts. The very tools designed to enforce order now amplified disorder. Inside German headquarters, the tone shifted from confidence to strain. Staff officers struggled to maintain a coherent picture of the front. Overlays piled up. Situation maps were revised constantly, sometimes contradicting each other. The pace of American movement forced a continuous cycle of reassessment that never caught up. The war was being fought in real time by Patton, and in delayed time by those trying to stop him. What made the situation intolerable was that Patton's advance did not announce itself with dramatic battles. There was no single engagement where German generals could say, "Here is where we stop him." Instead, control slipped away incrementally. A lost crossing here, a severed road there, a headquarters forced to move again. Each incident seemed manageable in isolation. Together, they dissolved the framework of containment entirely. German attempts to re-establish a continuous front failed repeatedly. The front line became porous, riddled with gaps Patton exploited instinctively. American forces appeared where German doctrine said they should not be. This unpredictability eroded confidence at every level. When commanders can no longer trust their own assessments, hesitation becomes the default. And hesitation in this campaign was fatal. By now, German generals understood that Patton had changed the nature of the fight. He was not attacking their strength, he was attacking their ability to understand and react. The battlefield was no longer something they could visualize, let alone control. Maps lagged reality. Orders chased movement. Decisions arrived after consequences. This was the true collapse of containment, not the loss of ground, but the loss of comprehension. German command was no longer shaping events, it was documenting their own displacement. And in a war where speed decided survival, that loss of understanding ensured that every German response would come too late to matter. Once German generals accepted that George S. Patton could no longer be contained through positional defense, they turned to what remained: forceful correction. Counterattacks were ordered not because conditions were favorable, but because doing nothing felt like surrender. These reactions were meant to restore initiative. Instead, they accelerated the collapse. Each hurried counterstroke exposed how far German command had fallen behind the tempo of the war Patton was imposing. The problem was timing. Counterattacks require preparation, concentration, and surprise. Patton's advance denied all three. German units were committed as soon as they arrived, often without full strength or coordination. Armor moved without infantry support. Infantry attacked without artillery preparation. Orders arrived late and were executed even later. By the time counterattacks were launched, Patton had already shifted his main effort elsewhere, leaving German forces striking at positions that no longer mattered. These failed countermeasures had a compounding effect. Every attempt to regain control consumed scarce fuel, ammunition, and manpower. Losses mounted without slowing the American advance. Worse, each failure confirmed Patton's core assumption. German command was reacting emotionally rather than strategically. That realization emboldened him. He pushed harder, widened the front, and forced German commanders to choose between equally bad options: commit reserves prematurely or lose ground uncontested. German generals attempted to concentrate their remaining strength for a decisive blow, but Patton's constant movement made concentration impossible. Units were pulled from one sector to plug gaps in another, only to find that the crisis had already moved on. This perpetual reshuffling exhausted formations and shattered cohesion. Soldiers arrived at new positions disoriented, undersupplied, and immediately under threat. The front became a series of emergency responses rather than a coordinated defense. Orders from higher command grew increasingly detached from reality. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs clashed with the operational necessity of withdrawal. German generals found themselves trapped between directives that demanded firmness and a battlefield that punished rigidity. Attempts to obey resulted in encirclement. Attempts to adapt invited punishment. The system forced failure regardless of choice. Patton's advance exploited this contradiction relentlessly. What made matters worse was the psychological toll. German commanders were accustomed to controlling engagements, shaping operations, and dictating tempo. Now they were forced into constant reaction. Decision-making became defensive and short-term. The focus narrowed from strategy to survival. Each headquarters relocation reinforced the sense that control was slipping away. Morale suffered, not from defeat alone, but from the feeling of helplessness against an opponent who never paused long enough to be confronted properly. Patton recognized this shift immediately. He increased pressure where German responses appeared strongest, knowing that those sectors were likely overcommitted. He bypassed stubborn resistance to strike softer targets, forcing German commanders to split their attention. Every reaction he provoked created new vulnerabilities elsewhere. The more aggressively the Germans tried to regain control, the more exposed they became. By this stage, German countermeasures no longer aimed to stop Patton, they aimed to slow disaster. But slowing disaster requires coherence, and coherence had already been lost. Units fought bravely in isolation, but bravery could not compensate for systemic failure. The war had become asymmetric in a way German doctrine could not address. Patton was fighting the enemy's decision-making process as much as its forces. The realization settled in among German generals that their own reactions were feeding the very chaos they feared. Each rushed order worsened confusion. Each failed counterattack confirmed American dominance of tempo. Containment was gone, recovery was no longer possible. What remained was damage control under relentless pressure. At this point, the question was no longer whether Patton could be stopped. It was whether anything could be salvaged from a defense that was unraveling faster with every attempt to restore it. The German command had lost more than territory. It had lost the ability to influence the course of events at all. By the time German generals accepted that George S. Patton could no longer be contained, the realization arrived with a devastating second truth. The Western Front was no longer something they controlled at all. This was not a temporary crisis or a localized breakthrough. It was a structural failure. The German command system, built on order, hierarchy, and deliberate control, had been overtaken by a form of warfare that punished every one of those principles. Patton did not defeat them by destroying their armies in a single blow. He defeated them by making their way of fighting obsolete. From this point forward, German actions were no longer strategic. They were reactive. Decisions were made to address the most recent emergency rather than shape the next phase of the war. Commanders no longer asked how to stop Patton. They asked where he was now and what had already been lost. The tempo of operations belonged entirely to the Americans. German headquarters existed in a constant state of catch-up, issuing orders that described a battlefield that had already moved on. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. Retreats became routes. Planned withdrawals dissolved into fragmented escapes. Units that might have been saved weeks earlier were now sacrificed simply to delay the inevitable. The loss of containment meant the loss of options. German generals were no longer choosing between good and bad outcomes. They were choosing between bad and worse. Patton's advance had a cascading effect far beyond the units directly in his path. His speed forced German forces elsewhere to react defensively, pulling back prematurely or abandoning positions to avoid encirclement. This weakened the entire Western Front. What began as a breakthrough became a general collapse of coherence. The front line ceased to exist as a continuous entity. It fractured into isolated pockets, each fighting its own private war against an enemy that refused to slow down. At the highest levels, the implications were grim. German leadership still spoke in terms of stabilizing fronts and launching counteroffensives, but those words no longer matched reality. Resources were insufficient. Time was gone. Initiative had been surrendered. Patton's campaign demonstrated that once momentum reached a certain point, no amount of discipline or bravery could restore control. The system itself had failed. This was the day German generals understood that the war in the West could no longer be managed. It could only be endured. Patton had not just outrun their defenses, he had outrun their decision-making. The traditional tools of command, maps, orders, reserves, were no longer effective against an opponent who treated speed as a constant and hesitation as a weakness to be exploited immediately. From here, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Western Front would not stabilize. Germany would not recover the initiative. Every subsequent operation would be shaped by the loss of control that began with Patton's advance. Paris would fall. The German border would be breached. The Reich itself would be forced onto the defensive everywhere at once. History often remembers battles and breakthroughs, but this moment mattered more than any single engagement. It was the moment when German generals realized they were no longer fighting a war they could control. They were reacting to one they could not slow down. Patton did not win the war alone, but on this day, he ensured that German command would never regain its footing. Containment had failed, control had vanished, and with it disappeared Germany's last real chance to shape the war in the West. This was not just the day German generals could no longer contain Patton. It was the day the Western Front stopped belonging to them at all.